I am Carol DeBoer-Langworthy, and it is my privilege today to introduce you to the collaborators who've made this wonderful new book, Live Oak with Moss, which is just out and is very different from most books of poetry. This book is it's a collection of Walt Whitman's 12 poems that he didn't really publish during his lifetime in his many iterations of Leaves of Grass or anything else. He suppressed these, and luckily we are here to witness their coming to life in print as collaborated on by the artist Brian Selznick and the Whitman scholar Karen Karbiener. I'm Carol DeBoer-Langworthy. I teach in the nonfiction writing program in the English department at Brown. We will be joined by my wonderful colleague, Professor Phil Gould, who is the Israel J. Kapstein Professor of English and is finishing a book on the Civil War and literary culture. So he knows a lot about Whitman. I'm not going to waste too much time talking anymore about the book because it's sort of self-explanatory. I should say that if you have questions, there will be a Q&A option that you can use to post your questions as you are thinking of them. They will be answered as we have time at the end. Okay, so the artist, Brian Selznick, is probably someone you know. He's the author and illustrator of many books for children, including the Caldecott award-winning The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which was made into the movie Hugo by Martin Scorsese. Brian illustrated the covers for the 20th anniversary edition of the Harry Potter series and has worked as a puppeteer. He's also been a writer for film, theater, and ballet. He graduated from RISD in 1988, but spent most of his time doing theater at Brown. So in a way, he instituted a dual Brown RISD degree before there was such a program. And then joining us will be his collaborator, the Whitman scholar, Karen Karbiener. I'm sorry if I murdered your last name. She teaches at New York University and has published widely and curated several exhibitions on Whitman, including Poet of the Body, this is his book, New York's Walt Whitman, published by the Grolier Club in 2019, with a new edition based on the exhibition available right now. A native New Yorker, Karen is a local public scholar, public intellectual. She is also president of the Walt Whitman Initiative, an interesting nonprofit organization serving as an organizing center for cultural activism and poetry-related events. She did the afterword to this book that puts all of its contents into perspective. So we will hear from these three people and take questions from the Q&A. I am going to bow out now and turn it over to Brian. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Carol. Hi, everybody. Very excited to be here with you today in this virtual space, imagining us all in a physical space together before too long. Thank you to Carol and Phil, and to Sophia and Sean and my friend Talia Field, who I did a lot of that theater with at Brown when I was a student at RISD. And really thrilled to be here with my friend Karen Karbiener, who's joining us from England, where she's currently living. And so we have an international group of people to chat with you today about Walt Whitman. And so I want to share with you a little bit about how this book came to be, my inspiration for it, what the book does. I'm going to share the book itself with you. And then Karen is going to put some of what I'm talking about and some of what Carol introduced us to in terms of what the poems are into a historic and cultural context, speaking about Whitman and queerness and New York. these poems, I first learned about these poems from the artist and illustrator and writer Maurice Sendak, who made Where the Wild Things Are, who I became friends with. And he told me about this group of 12 poems that were written by Whitman about a love affair that he had with another man. And he said that these poems were never published as Whitman wrote them. Instead, he cut them up, rearranged them, and hid them somewhere in leaves of grass. And no one knew about them for 100 years. And finally, a Whitman scholar found some clues, found some notebooks, and pieced together these original 12 poems. This is how I learned the story. Karen will be able to tell you the actual historical facts around that story. But what I heard from Maurice, that outline was so intriguing. And this idea that the poems themselves came out, like they were in the closet for a really long time. And then it was the 1950s when they were rediscovered and brought out. But they mostly were known by Whitman scholars and not by the public at large. So our book that Karen and I made, Live Oak with Moss, is really the first time that the poems are being introduced to the public in general. And we're very proud of being part of that process. I'm going to share the book with you. Maybe I'll do that now. I'm going to share my screen. There's music that goes along with it that you should be able to hear. If you don't hear it, don't worry, because it's just a few minutes moving through the images in the book. So what you're going to see are most of the drawings that appear in Live Oak with Moss. And then you're going to come to a fully white page. In the book, that's where we then read the 12 poems, or begin to read the 12 poems. And then it goes back to the pictures that you will see. And then there's an afterword in the book, and written by Karen. And then we've sort of recreated the original notebook with the 12 poems in Whitman's handwriting at the very end. So this presentation, in a way, echoes the structure of the book itself. So I am going to share the screen now. Share sound. All right. So as soon as I press play here, the sound and the slideshow will begin, and I'm going to stop talking as we move through the images, and I'll come back at the end of the images.
Not the heat flames up and consumes, not the sea waves hurry in and out, not the air delicious and dry, the air of the ripe summer bears lightly along white down balls of myriads of seeds, wafted, sailing gracefully to drop where they may. Not these, oh, none of these, more than the flames of me, consuming, burning for his love whom I love. Oh, none more than I, hurrying in and Does the tide hurry, seeking something and never give up? Oh, I the same, to seek my lifelong lover. Oh, nor down balls, nor perfumes, nor or the high rain emitting clouds are born through the open air. More than my copious soul is born through the open air, wafted in all directions for friendship, for
So that is the shape of the illustrations at the beginning of the book that we've created. You just heard Robert Ian singing a setting that he wrote of one of the poems. This book actually began as a puppet show. Before I made it a book, I thought I would make this as a puppet show. I make puppets. And so this is how the puppet show began. That's Robert Ian on stage with me with his cello. I'm performing the entire show in this suitcase. It's a 4x6 inch opening, and then it's projected large onto the stage. So I'm at the same time making a private, intimate act public, which itself echoes the fate of these poems. And then the show carries on, and a friend of mine named Basil Twist, who's an amazing puppeteer who I've worked with, did a show called Dogu Gaishi, which is a Japanese puppetry technique where screens open. And so I used this Dogu Gaishi technique in the puppet show and had these images opening and opening and opening as Robert was singing his settings for the poems. And so the opening of these screens, as you can see, were very inspirational when it came time to make it into a book. It was Karen who came to me and said that the 200th anniversary of Whitman's birth was coming up, and maybe we can make a book. And I thought about doing this story of these poems as a book. And one of the complicating factors was that Sendak used to talk about how he believed that poetry should not be illustrated because it's one kind of writing that's supposed to go directly from the page to the reader's imagination. And so my challenge was to figure out how to illustrate a book that I learned about, the idea of whom I got from Maurice Sendak. I dedicated the book to him, but without illustrating poems. So what I did was I thought I would have all those pictures first and then come to the poems themselves and let them live on their own without pictures. So the images serve as a kind of bridge or stepping stone that take you into the drawings. This is a sequence in the puppet show where my left hand seduces my right hand.
Of what use were it for him?
You can hear Bob singing another one of his settings.
To seek to be called.
And then just a little bit, the way I work, I do these little thumbnail sketches, little thumbnail drawings, and then I cut them out and glue them together and make these little books so that I can see how the page turn works. Because like those screens opening or the curtains opening on a stage, the page turn is the technology that a book has that allows us to move from one moment to the next, like editing in a movie. All those parallels have always been very interesting to me. So I first work out all of my ideas in the little dummies like that. So I am going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to hand the presentation over to my dear friend Karen, who will tell us a little bit about what I just got wrong. All right, hi Karen.
Nothing. You got nothing wrong, Brian. It's so good to see you. And Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. This is such a pleasure to be in such good company. Um, and I'm also going to share my screen just to get us started and hopefully be as neat and smooth as Brian was. And I'm going to start with an image that is probably very familiar to most people. And here he is, the poet that we often call America's poet, Walt Whitman, in his frontispiece image in the 1855, the first edition of Leaves of Grass. And a lot of people know him as democracy's poet, America's poet. But for Brian and me, he is also the first queer spokesperson, America's first queer spokesperson and social and activist. And it's through these poems that we hear that voice. They're really his first sustained attempt to describe his passion for other men. They're very daring. They come before the Calamus poems, which I think a lot of you must know. And he's doing many things in these poems that are there's no precedent for them. He is thinking about a community of lovers, a supportive community of lovers about 100 years before any LGBT movement started. And he's really trying to define same-sex love, the idea of homosexuality, way before, decades before that word becomes a common word. So they're revolutionary poems to us. And Brian and I are very pleased, as he already said, to be the first to really present them to the public. They have been known to scholars, as he said. Fredson Bowers, he was actually a bibliographer, discovered them at UVA, and in 1953 published them in a journal called Studies in Bibliography. But as you probably can imagine, they did not really find a voice until the 1990s, really, until the gay rights movement started. So this book is very revolutionary in presenting these poems. And you might be wondering why Whitman didn't present them himself. He's tricky on his own. He's obscured a lot of his own past. We really have to dig down, and not a lot of people kept track of someone like Whitman, who was the second son of 8 children to, a relatively well-off, but barely literate family. His father was a farmer. His mom was she was a homemaker. And he grew up in Long Island. And at age 4, the father decided to move everyone to Brooklyn. He had heard about this building boom, and you're looking at it. This is the building boom of Brooklyn here. This is actually a painting at the Brooklyn Museum of Art by Francis Guy around 1819 called Winter Scene in Brooklyn. Whitman moved to Brooklyn in 1821. So this is pretty much what he saw. It's kind of in the Dumbo area. We're basically where the Fulton Ferry Landing is and looking up into Brooklyn. Whitman did a lot of writing when he was young, but it was, not necessarily really good poetry. He wrote about 22 rhyming poems in his youth. He wrote a lot of journalism. In fact, he became known as a pretty radical journalist. And one of the reasons that he got out of New York in those first 40, 50 years is because his journalism got so radical at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle that he was fired. So he took his favorite brother, Thomas Jefferson Whitman, and they went down to New Orleans for 3 months. And it would seem, it's a very short period of time, but it was the one place that Whitman really was beyond the radar of his family, besides his brother. And it is also the only place he would have become acquainted with the title of this series, Live Oak with Moss. And you're looking at the angel oak right outside of Charleston, magnificent anthropomorphic tree. It's unbelievable to me, and I think to Brian too, how incredibly beautiful and strong and human these trees look. So perhaps there's always been a theory floating around that something important happened in New Orleans, something having to do with his sexuality, maybe his first affair with another man. He comes back to New York and he is enchanted with Manhattan. He's a Brooklyn boy, but he goes over, takes the ferry over almost every day. And his passion for the city, for Brian and me, is really well represented by a French photographer named Victor Provost, who arrives in New York from Paris in the 1850s. And he takes these magnificent calotypes. These are wax paper negatives of New York scenes. And it's really unusual because there's a huge fad for portraiture, but Provost is in love with the city. And as you can see probably from the horse on the right there, the horse and carriage, the way that cameras worked back then, you know, you could, if there was something moving in the picture, it would just not pick up. The exposure was too long. So these busy city scenes became very empty, very haunting, right? And there's something kind of big and powerful and moody about these pictures that captured our imagination. And you can see here a page from our book where Brian has inserted images of men, and that of course is Whitman on fire down there. That's right in front of Jeremiah Gurney's Daguerrean Gallery down on Broadway. And so it's really neat to play with photography with a photograph. And I have to say, I think this book, and Brian can tell you more about it, Brian used so many mediums to bring to life our ideas of Whitman's passion and his cruising on the streets of New York. Here is Whitman at a place called Pfaff's Cellar, which the building still exists down at the corner of Bleecker and Broadway. And at the time, in the late 1850s, this was the bar to go to, right? It was the Bohemian hangout. That's William Dean Howells, not looking particularly bohemian, but shaking the hand of a much more bohemian looking Walt Whitman with his shirt open. Famously, actors and all sorts of radicals gathered in this place. And Whitman, it was his one time that he was congregating with other people. And he met lots of really interesting men down there. The Fred Gray Association was starting down there. That was allegedly the first gay men's club, possibly in the United States, most likely in New York City. And Whitman started keeping these journals while he was commuting to Pfaff's from Brooklyn, where he lived. They are like long gay poems. And I'm bringing you just a couple pages here for you to look at. On the left, I'll just interpret it if you can't see it that well. He's just writing names of men and their characteristics. 4th Avenue, Arthur, big round sandy hair, course open. Petey, round head and face. Wallace, sailor boy, English, was in Japan. And then on the right side, Tom Riley, handsome Irish fighter. John Kiernan, loafer, pretty good looking. So Whitman is experimenting in every which way in this seminal period, the late 1850s, while we think he is writing these poems. And this lovely portrait, painted by his friend Charles Hine, shows him in full bloom. And you've got this really cool combination of Whitman having a sunburnt expression. You know, he looks like a working man in the face, and yet he's wearing this very bohemian baronial collar. If you go see the painting in Brooklyn, you can actually see his chest hair sprouting out, super macho, really alluring image of Whitman during those Pfaff's years, and also when he was writing Live Oak with Moss. And here is the first page of the little notebook that he made, folding 11 sheets just once and putting them together, very informal production. And you can see even at the top, Live Oak with Moss, changes the title to Calamus Leaves. And then really in the 1860 edition, when he comes out with some of the poems, he calls them Calamus. And that's what you have in this next image here, which I think is much more familiar to lots of people. They are heralded as these incredible LGBT, worthy poems, but of course, Live Oak with Moss is preceding them. I'm going to wrap up because we just wanted to introduce things, and I'm really happy to answer any questions. But I wanted to bring you at least one of the Live Oak with Moss poems really close up. And you're looking at the first manuscript page of poem 8. It was changed and reordered, and it became Calamus 9, and then Whitman shut it down. He didn't want to publish it anymore. going to show you the second page of this. And you can see, although there's very clean writing on the manuscript, right? It almost looks like a fair copy. He's putting stuff together all the time, and probably to save money on paper, because we're not talking about a wealthy person, but still they have this sort of, homemade, patched up quality that seems so, from the heart. So this is the way the poem looks in our book. And I'm going to read this one to you, although I see that there's something interfering with me actually getting to the poem. Let me see. I might actually stop sharing because then I can read it in peace, but I do want you to see it. Let me try to get as far as I can. And I can change the screen actually. Let's see. Even better, I'm going to do this. So let's see. Sorry, guys. I very seldom use the program that I'm using now. I'm going to start here. And then when I get to the difficulty, I'll move to the next screen. This is just the one poem. Hours continuing long, sore and heavy-hearted. Hours of the dusk, when I withdraw to a lonesome and unfrequented spot, seating myself, leaning my face in my hands. Hours sleepless, deep in the night, when I go forth. Pacings and stifling plaintive cries. Oh, weeks and months are passing, but I believe I am never to forget. Sullen and suffering hours, I am ashamed, but it is useless. I am what I am. Hours of my torment. I wonder if other men ever have the like out of the like feelings. Is there even one other like me, distracted, his friend, his lover lost to him? Is he too as I am now? Does he still rise in the morning, dejected, thinking who is lost to him? And at night, awaking, think who is lost? Does he too harbor his friendship, silent and endless? Harbor his anguish and passion? Does some stray reminder or the casual mention of a name bring the fit back upon him, taciturn and depressed? Does he see himself reflected in me? In these hours, does he see the face of his hours reflected? Such a moving poem to me. I feel it is such a confessional poem, and I could go on and on, but let me just point out a few things. It's really interesting to me that it's such a formal looking poem, because if you know anything about Whitman, he's the father of free verse. You usually see the lines spread across the page, and there's really little concern with form. These live oak with moss poems resemble sonnets, and this one especially. It has 12 lines, it doesn't have 14. But as you're reading it, you just wonder if those 2 lines are missing for a reason. And sometimes I wonder if the missing couplet is about the missing couple that he seems to be talking about in this piece. The sounds of the poem are great too. The repetition of the word hours really kind of gets under your skin. And of course you hear O-U-R-S as well as H-O-U-R-S here. It stretches out those lines in the beginning. You can feel how anxious and he feels like he's been held back. And then the confessional moment really happens in the middle of the poem. So it is kind of like a sonnet, right? It does sort of have a volta, a change in the middle. And it is this moment of confession. I am ashamed, but it is useless. I am what I am. This is Walt Whitman, LGBT champion coming out on page. And I think for Brian and for me, it has just been really moving to be able to work with these poems that Whitman was so personal with, that he had to rip up at the end of his life. So thank you, everyone. Lots more to say, but that should start us off.
Thank you very much. This has been fascinating, and we already have a couple of questions from attendees. And I've got a bunch of questions, but I don't want to preempt our other participants. So one person in the audience asks, and this is really for either of your consideration, but what do you think is the most important aspect of this particular work, for the world we live in today? And I think each of you in different ways was approaching that. And I would just kind of gloss that issue by, saying that I think this, what you're offering is a very different Walt Whitman than the kind of Whitman who was canonized the American poet in the 1940s and 50s, as American literature is kind of being invented in the academy and among public intellectuals. So this attendee was just saying, I'm just curious about the, all the years looking at an artist's work, and now new artistic interventions are taking place in today's world. How does Whitman speak to this? So, any thoughts, Brian, Karen? And then there are a couple other questions in the queue as well.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in New Jersey, and there were buildings and rest stops on highways named after Walt Whitman, which looking back seems perhaps a little queer, but I think the people naming the Walt Whitman rest stop were not doing it with any queerness in mind. It was done with this idea of Whitman as the great gray poet, the American master, and a kind of assumed heterosexuality, because he also wrote as powerfully about heterosexual sex as he did about homosexual sex. But and in fact, in the 19th century, Karen can talk a little bit more about this, but it was the heterosexual sex in his poems that got him in trouble. The homosexual sex in the 19th century looked like male friendship, like we're really close, and men slept in the same bed normally. So the queerness was very easy to overlook by the culture. And so that idea that I was talking about earlier, with the sense of the poems themselves coming out, and us as a society, as the world, being able to understand the complexity of people's lives, and understanding that Whitman wasn't just an icon, he was a queer icon. And that doesn't take him away from being what he was perceived as previously. It adds to what he is. And, I didn't know anybody was gay when I was growing up in the 70s. Like, I didn't know the Village People were gay. And so it was not, they dressed up in costumes. Like, who doesn't like to do that? And for the younger people who might be listening, you can look up the Village People. They're going to seem very, very gay to you. And so for me, that's what was most important. How about for you, Karen?
Well, I think just because of the way that Whitman is usually packaged, the poet of "Oh Captain, My Captain," or "Song of Myself," like the broad democratic voice that we're used to. These poems are often surprising because not just because of what he's saying, but how he's saying. He's pretty insecure here. There's a lot more questions. You see a lot more doubt. That "I celebrate myself" guy is really not here. So I feel like for my students and myself, the poems are really valuable in seeing kind of the inner, the trouble that Whitman had with coming to terms with certain things, and especially just coming to terms with loving men and not really having a community for that. Something maybe was starting at Fops, and that's why he was attracted to that space. But actually sort of finding a place in literature to put these ideas down. There have been so many attempts, and Phil, you know this as well as I do, to heteronormalize Whitman. I remember the first biography that was written about Whitman after he died was by a guy named Binns, B-I-N-N-S. And there was this whole theory that Whitman had had an affair with a woman down south and had all these grandchildren from her. And, even though there was no evidence for this, it just like kept going. People believed this. And this kind of idea that maybe, this is not a gay poet. This is just like an adventurous, big, broad voice. So I think that's why Whitman kind of tucked these poems away. And quite frankly, I also think it's why from 1953, when Fredson Bowers found these, it took till the 1990s for everybody to actually start saying, wait a second, these are amazing pieces. And even till
that's
20,
yeah,
please.
that's a really important point. I think for the audience, putting both your comments together, reading Whitman shows us, number one, as you were suggesting, Brian, that sexuality in the mid-19th century is much more ambiguous in terms of homosocial as opposed to like homoerotic relations. And it's not really till the end of the 19th century where sex and homosexuality starts to get kind of codified in the culture. And that, you're right, Karen, that leads to this. I mean, Calamus has been part of the Whitman canon since it was being published in this morphing thing called Leaves of Grass since the 1860s. But you're right, it's invisible until, and decades after Fredson Bowers finds this. The ironic thing to this, we'll turn to the second question in a moment, is that the canonical book about or involving Whitman as the great American poet is F.O. Matheson's American Renaissance, a closeted homosexual at Harvard who writes the most famous, book of 19th century American literature and doesn't really address a queer Whitman. So I think that puts into context just how important, even landmark, what you're doing. Another question in the queue, and we'll get to all of them, don't worry folks, is that someone asked Brian, I'm curious about your use of boxes as a form of structure, puppeteering or a luggage case, miniature bookmaking and so forth. Could you talk a little bit more about unboxing and gaze as it might relate to the ethics of illustrating and exposing and enacting and bringing to light poetry that was originally meant to be obscured, hidden, and secreted?
That is such an interesting question. And I find that when I'm working, I need something that I can control. The world is so chaotic. It only gets more chaotic minute by minute. And when I was working in puppetry, I was performing for Basil Twist, who makes these giant stage size extraordinary pieces or in giant tanks of water. But when I began making something, I was living in a little tiny apartment on the Upper West Side. I had a little tiny desk. So I felt like I needed to make little tiny puppets. And the tradition of 19th century toy theater always fascinated me. So working within that tradition. But for me, having boundaries allows me to get to the kind of freedom and chaos that I experience in the world, right? But for myself, I need to have a boundary within which I'm working so that I don't myself then feel like I'm out of control, right? Like one of the things when I'm making something is about the importance and the pleasure of feeling the illusion of having control for a minute. We don't actually have control, but if I decide that my entire puppet show is going to be 3 by 5 inches, or I'm going to illustrate a book and there's going to be one drawing on each page and the book is going to be this big, and I know that the book, and my books are long, like I do long books, but they have I know what the last page is going to be. Like I know when there's going to be a last page. I can pick it. I can say it's going to be 600 pages, but it's not a 2,000 page book. It is still a book you can pick up, and 600 is on the edge of what you can pick up, but it's mostly pictures. So you feel like you have control when you're experiencing it. I just did a new book called Kaleidoscope that sort of conceptually comes out of Live Oak with Moss in a certain way, although it doesn't have very many pictures, it's mostly text. But conceptually, it's about having these boundaries within which you can go to extreme places of emotion. So that's what I would begin to say about that.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. And so just, to clarify then, this is kind of your modus operandi artistically, psychologically, spiritually, perhaps. It's not something you invented for this project. It's how you roll as an artist.
Yeah, I think I worked instinctively about a lot of things and then came to be curious about why I was doing some of the things I was doing
Mhm.
and realized the thing that I then just explained to you. Like I didn't start off thinking, oh, I really need control and I really need, it was like
Yeah.
my desk is small, or I have 1,000 things I'm thinking about. How do I control it? And I don't know, I think there might be a relationship to that with poetry. I don't know if that connects with how you think about Whitman's poetry at all, Karen, but that when I look at poetry, even the wildness of Whitman's poetry, which can go on and on and on, still has a certain interesting kind of boundary.
But even, especially with Live Oak with Moss, which, as we were talking about, they are much more controlled. A lot of them do resemble the sonnet, which is a really controlled form. I wonder, just in light of what you're saying, if Whitman, felt more comfortable exploring these really deep emotions in a really controlled format, right? Because those big wide lines that grace the first edition of Leaves of Grass, maybe there's even just too much freedom in there. But there's the intimacy of working with a small space, which I guess too, right? Like a depth to it that's maybe, that particular limited sonnet form helped him deal with.
That idea of intimacy, I think, that's really the nub to what makes this group of poems so distinctive from the large, democratic, yawping, sprawling quality of Song of Myself. And yeah, I think that fits, and it puts Brian's practice and Whitman's practice in a particular kind of perspective that's intriguing. Um, there's another question in the queue that involves Whitman and Emily Dickinson, the other kind of major canonical 19th century American poet, very different than Whitman. But this attendee wants to know if, is anything in Whitman and Dickinson scholarship that can contribute to a growing awareness of queer artists generally, or in American literature generally, or today. Any thoughts about this, either on a scholarly end or comparing to Dickinson?
Well, I don't know if I'm answering this sort of, from the side, but one thing that happens when you get a poet like Whitman is that you get an enormous response from him from other queer artists. So I have to look at the question here. How does Whitman and Dickinson scholarship contribute to growing awareness of queer artists in our history? So this is less about Whitman than about scholarship itself. Well, I hope scholars keep on the ball about, just developing trends in queer studies. But for myself, I guess just digging deeply into a poet that otherwise may be read very broadly. And I think, Whitman presents, an interesting but sort of cliched image of what a poet can be for most people who are reading him in high school with typical textbooks. But to go deeply into these poems that are less on the table, and find those conversations that he himself couldn't finish. If scholarship can do anything worthy, it's to finish the conversations that even the artists have left unsaid. And I guess that's, Brian, what we are trying to do with this book. We actually debated quite a bit on whether or not to publish it, because Whitman didn't want to do it, right? Like Whitman felt uncomfortable getting these poems out there. He ripped them up, he put them away, and it's only by chance that Fredson Bowers put them together at UVA and discovered this whole notebook. But I think if scholars and artists can do anything, it is to complete those conversations that in the past were just too uncomfortable to complete.
And I will add that Maurice Sendak had very interesting things to say about Whitman and Emily Dickinson. When I met Maurice, I had just illustrated a children's book about Walt Whitman, and he had just started reading Walt Whitman for the first time. And one of the things he said to me was that for most of Maurice's life, he didn't trust or believe Walt Whitman because he couldn't imagine someone in the 19th century being that comfortable with queerness when Maurice in the 20th century was scared of and avoided his own sexuality for so long. And Maurice eventually came out very publicly. There's some amazing interviews with him on the Colbert Report and with Terry Gross on Fresh Air that are profoundly moving about his relationship with his own queerness. But Maurice loved Emily Dickinson. Like Maurice's best friends in certain way were Mozart, Emily Dickinson, Keats, William Blake, Van Gogh, a lot of artists who in their lifetimes weren't recognized or didn't, obviously there's some exceptions in this list, but that sense of people being discovered after they die. And I tried to read Dickinson for years and could never do it. I just couldn't understand her until the TV series Dickinson with Haley Seinfeld, which any of you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you watch it. It's extraordinary. All the research for the series just went to Harvard. It was that based in fact, but it explores Emily Dickinson's imagination and her wildness through this very anachronistic view of the 19th century, where she's like a modern young woman trapped in this 19th century world. But it's brilliant. And there's an episode where she meets Whitman and she's reading him. She's affected
You're
by
kidding.
him.
I have not seen that. That's amazing.
I've been meaning to tell you. Whitman's played by Billy Eichner, and he's working as a nurse. She has become overwhelmed by Leaves of Grass, the first edition, and she travels to go meet him, which she never actually did in real life.
Oh no, as far as I know, she pretty much disapproved. Yeah.
But the series allows for that kind of imaginative leaps.
Yeah.
And and she meets Louisa May Alcott, played by Zosia Mamet. Like, it is amazing.
Yeah.
And every episode is structured around a different poem. And after the series ended, my husband recommended a scholarly book that I can't remember the name of the scholar who wrote it, but she looks at about 180 of the poems and it goes into each one in depth about what they mean. But in terms of like controlling language and rhythm, Emily Dickinson, like every one of her poems had the same rhythm to them. And yet within that rhythm, sometimes it's 2 stanzas, sometimes it's very long, sometimes and what she's doing with language, she's going everywhere. She's going deep into her soul. She's going far out into the world, into places she's never gone, but in a rhythmic structure that almost never changes. And
like Whitman, or germane to our discussion this afternoon, she dies a few years before Whitman, and her first editors are her brother and her brother's mistress, also her best friend, and they excise and suppress all of the kind of many love poems. It's
which were written to the wife, to the brother's wife.
Yeah, and so it's a complex Amherst neighborhood melodrama, but to the point that what the poems we get, what we are left to read, are highly mediated by a culture's own ideological, and in this case sexual, set of protocols and decorum. Really. So our time is starting to go on here. We've got a few minutes left. I was interested if you had any comments for us as a group, or could let us know anything about how you work together, how you collaborate, what rewards you find from it, what's most difficult about it, what you've learned from it in your own work individually and together. Any thoughts?
Oh, such an exciting process to work with Brian. He is electric. And I remember our conversations about the book, because I don't think we ever had a disagreement about anything. But I think one of the issues we talked about most, Brian, was the order in which we would present the book. Because, typically, if you think about an illustrated book of poems, you've got a poem on one side and an illustration on the other side. We did not want to do that. We wanted to figure out a new way to get people involved in poetry, really present complex literary content, but maybe provide people with a key to it so it wouldn't be that intimidating. I feel like, you know, poetry is the most intimidating of the arts, right? Everybody gets scared away by it. So we decided that Brian's images, just on their own, without any language, just, you know, a short introduction by him, just floating through them, and he gave you a, you know, a sample of that, gives you a sort of a key to some of the major themes and the feelings that you feel when you read the poems. So I really love, and I think that this book really does something I haven't seen any other book do. And it's because of Brian's magic. But presenting those images, it's kind of a story, but kind of not, right? It makes me feel more than it makes me understand. And then you get to the poems. And then if you want, you can plunge deeper into, you know, the background of the poems. And then the coup de grace, seeing the poetry little chapbook put back together again. So I don't know, Brian, I really loved working with you because, again, just creative wildfire. So it was really fun to watch you do that. I felt very privileged working with that.
Well, thank you. And I felt the same way. You know, it's whenever I'm working on a project, I always approach experts in the field who know what, you know, what obscure thing I might be writing about, or what famous person I might be writing about, because I've done a lot of books that are set in, you know, or based in reality, even though most of my fiction is historical fiction, you know, where I'm taking something from the real world and creating a fictional framework around it. And, you know, and what was so nice about Karen is, you know, we hit it off really in a way first as friends and brought together by Whitman. But when you have a friend who shares that kind of passion and you're able to turn to each other for the thing that you don't know about, or that you haven't thought about, or that brings a new perspective. I mean, a friend of mine at Brown early on, you know, one of the best pieces of advice I feel like I got in college was always hang out with people who are smarter than you. And that really has been something I have tried to guide my life by, and it's very helpful. And you know, so being able to sit with Karen at the library with a collection of original photographs, like the streetscapes that she was sharing with everybody earlier.
That was the favorite moment. Like, that was the New York Historical Society that has a really great collection of those Victor Provost calotypes, and just to look at them with Brian and to see the originals, that was just extraordinary.
Right.
And that kind of set you on fire to do these collages. And am I right that was your first attempt at collage in a book?
Yeah, I had never done so many different techniques in a single book. Like, usually there's a technique, and usually it's pencil or painting. But the images, because we're going on such a, you know, sort of abstracted journey through these images in Live Oak, they start with pencil, they become paintings, they turn into collages. I use some computer stuff for the first time, which I had never used before in a book, you know, before returning us back to the pencil drawings. And so, yeah, so I had this idea that I wanted to use these streetscapes because I had a sequence in the puppet show where there was a sequence in the streets of New York, and you knew about the Provost photographs and set up this appointment. And again, that's another one of my favorite moments of any project, is where you have access, you find yourself, you get access to the original material, and you go and you sit with it and you touch it for as much as you're allowed to, even if it's with the white gloves. You know, you have it in your presence, and that is always a transformative experience. And so, and then, like Karen was saying, like figuring out what order everything was going to be, because I think a lot of times when people pick up books, they think about the writing, perhaps. If it's an illustrated book, they think about the pictures. But I'm always intrigued by the fact that everything in every book is a decision. The typeface, the number of pages, where things go in the book. Most books have a certain structure, but you can break that. And so, we could have done it where Karen's conversation around or exploration of the history comes first, so that you could really have all of that context when you then move into the abstraction of the pictures. And in that case, the pictures would have felt like a kind of breath out after having taken in all of this information. And that would have been a valid.
That's a great Whitman metaphor.
Breath out.
His poetry. I think unfortunately, because this is just so fascinating, our time is starting to wind down. I just wanted to turn back to Carol DeBoer-Langworthy. I want to just say from personally that just how fascinating this is. It's been a joy to meet both of you. Also wanted to thank the Brown Arts Initiative, and Sean Tavares and Sophia LaCava Bohannon. I'll sign off now, but thank you very much.
Right.
And thank you,
so
Phil.
much.
Yes.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you all. This has really been fascinating. What a great way to study literature and art. This is the way to put it all together, especially with music. Thank you. Yeah, we do want to also thank Professor Talia Field, who is the director of the Brown Arts Initiative at the moment. And you can find this book, you can buy it through the indiebound.org link that I think you should be able to see. It's worth every penny. It's a really incredible collectible item as well. It's a piece of art. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, the Brown Arts Initiative. Keep up the good work. I'll say goodbye now. Bye.
Right. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol. Bye, everyone.
Bye.